So, today, I'm going to continue to pay my penance for once being a new atheist by taking another look at some of the figures on YouTube who are still doing atheist content for some reason. In the first one, we showed that Counterarguments doesn't understand how to recognize fascism, and in the second one, we showed that Stephen Woodford of Rationality Rules is really just a conduit for the intellectual dark web, a group so profoundly shitty that their morality expert fearmongers about race war. But Sam Harris is just totally not racist, you guys. That's not racist at all. Where would you get an idea like that? Today, we're going to be talking about a friend of Woodford's, Alex J. O'Connor, also known as CosmicSkeptic. He is a vegan, he plays guitar, and apparently he's been making lesbians question their sexuality since 2013. Alex deals mostly with philosophy, and he is very well read. He uses this, along with his accent, socioeconomic status, and confidence in public speaking, to make himself seem a little smarter than he actually is. He is, in fact, much better at this than the other people I've covered so far. But like most of his ilk, he strips away all context from the political issues he talks about, and has even admitted that history is a weak spot for him. So he tends to talk about issues in isolation. And it should come as no surprise that once he's shaped them to fit his ideology, they don't really fit back into reality when someone tries to recontextualize them. In this vein, there are a couple videos I could have chosen. There was the one where he said that protesters trying to physically block people from attending a talk by Steve Bannon at the Oxford Union should be ashamed, when in truth it's Oxford Union who should be ashamed for platforming a fascist. But I've already done free speech on college campuses twice, so that's a no-go. Or there's the video where he had the utter obliviousness to call Slavoj Žižek pretentious and take a random thought he had way out of context. But Slavoj Žižek makes it really easy to take him out of context, so that hardly seems fair. So instead, I've chosen his video titled Liberal Hypocrisy on Islam. As always, I suggest you watch this video first. It's a tight 9 minutes, and you can make sure that I don't take him out of context or anything, since I'm not going to show the whole video, but I am going to show most of it. Okay? Let's do this.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and it looks as though my studies have had a bit of an effect on my upload schedule. My apologies, of course. Alas, I thought that I would take an evening to make a somewhat more discursive video than usual, since that's much easier to do in my current situation. Now, I was recently watching some argument or other about Islam and its rather less than admirable moral qualities of misogyny, racism, and violence when I was struck dumbfounded coming to a realization about a crystally obvious hypocrisy that surrounds this ugly debate. And the reason I was so surprised was principally because I couldn't believe that I hadn't really thought about it before, so I thought that I'd share it with you as some food for thought and conversation. So let me lay some groundwork here. I want to discuss a stark hypocrisy that I've noticed among liberals in particular, and I'm talking about the modern American understanding of the word liberal. Now, I'm really not the first commentator to express my bemusement at the fact that liberals, who ostensibly claim to value gender equality, freedom of speech, religious freedom, etc., have come to ally themselves with an ideology that may as well have been created as a purposeful negation of each of these values. Islam's scripture and tradition is littered with inexcusable offences in this regard, and yet today it finds itself completely protected from criticism, not by Islamic fascists who want my head in a bag, but by the very ideology that was founded on the exact opposite of the religion's core values. That ideology, of course, is liberalism.
Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here. First, I want to be upfront and say that I am not a liberal, in either sense of the word that he bounces back and forth between here. In the modern American context that he's openly using here, liberal means anyone to the left of Strom Thurmond that someone wants to criticize until they hit Mao Zedong, and there are still dipshits who call him a liberal. There is no real clear sense of what liberal means in my country. What he's talking about are the Democrats and those who tend to vote for them, the so-called socially liberal, which to me is completely meaningless. There's really no adequate way to separate social and economic issues, but that's not what this video is about. In truth, the Republicans are liberals too, right up until you slide far right enough to hit the fascists. I am a leftist, and by that I mean a staunch anti-capitalist. And since liberalism as an ideology was created to prop up the social and economic systems that we now call capitalism, a status quo that both left and right liberals want to maintain, I'm just not a liberal. So to me, drawing a line between the two parties and saying this one's liberal and this one isn't is a bit of a difference without a distinction. While I do recognize that what Alex is trying to do is use the colloquial version of the term liberal, misuse of the term liberal is a pet peeve of mine. As the far better YouTube philosopher Oliver Thorne pointed out in his video series, What Was Liberalism? Liberalism assumes capitalism as the mode of production, and as a result is built on a number of contradictions. Freedom of speech, but with notable exceptions. Democracy, but with broad exceptions. Self-determination, but again with broad exceptions. So if you want to talk about liberal hypocrisy, it exists, but in ways that Alex is going to gloss over. But this video isn't a critique of liberalism. Go watch PhilosophyTube's series. And oh boy, do I have some things to say about his attitude towards Islam. Most of it I'll get to later, but for now I can't not address his overall outlook on the religion. Like others who share his ideology, he treats Islam like a monolith, as though it has remained the same across all of space and time, even though I know he knows that they were the keepers of so-called Western civilization during the medieval period, and that Islam is more diverse than even Christianity. I'm sure when pressed on this, he would say that of course he doesn't view Islam as a monolith, but his rhetoric contradicts this. He also, more than once, frames Islam as being antithetical to liberalism, which it is. If you treat Islam like a monolith where only the most extreme interpretation applies, and you ignore the millions of Muslim liberals in the world.
My best guess is that liberalism's inherent sympathy for marginalized groups has led it to, quite correctly, come to the defense of innocent Muslims who are victims of genuinely bigoted idiocy in the form of harassment and verbal or physical assault on a regular basis, since they are a minority group that oftentimes is predominantly ethnically homogenous. The problem is, of course, that this has gone too far, and it's now pathetically easy to spin any objection to the ideological tenets of Islam as a hate crime or something of the sort.
Now, he's sort of correct here. Not about the defense of marginalized people going too far. Oh, no. See, liberalism has no inherent concern for minority groups. This is something that occurs among left liberals in spite of liberalism, and frankly, it's part of the reason why they're so bad at it, and why leftism is more prevalent among marginalized groups. And notice how he only talks about individual forms of oppression that Muslims experience. From this, I'm going to infer that, as a liberal himself, he lacks a systemic critique, which is something that'll become a little bit more apparent later on. It's likely that he believes, at least at the structural level, that equality has been more or less achieved. As everyone's favorite lobster man puts it, everyone more or less has equality of opportunity under the current system. But we shouldn't be trying to go for equality of outcome. But since one generation's outcome affects the next generation's opportunity, this distinction is practically meaningless. I realize that I am making assumptions about Alex's politics, but this is a common liberal view, even if they wouldn't put it necessarily in those words, and it's a horribly ignorant one at that. So look, I'd be more than happy to be wrong on this, and will gladly accept evidence to the contrary. But again, his lack of acknowledgement of the systemic marginalization that Muslims face seems to reflect this. Obviously, if you view bigotry as being basically interpersonal, then some rich Anglo coming out and saying, hey, the Quran says some really shitty things would seem perfectly innocent. But if you look at that with the history of racism, imperialism, war, and colonialism in mind, and realizing that our societies are literally built upon that history, then you might understand why Batman might start yelling at you. And if people are still being marginalized at a systemic level, then if anything, defense of them hasn't gone far enough.
So I know I'm preaching to the choir here. We all know that this is bad. But why exactly is it hypocritical? Now, of course, it goes against the principles of traditional liberalism, but there's no reason that these can't change, so that's not the problem. No, the hypocrisy lies in a slightly broader consideration of the liberal worldview as I commonly see it defended, in debates other than the Islamic discussion as well as within it. Let me explain. To illustrate my point, I want you to imagine a conversation between me and a modern liberal. Now, suppose a liberal were to tell me that they think that society in general is inherently sexist, with built-in racism and widespread homophobia. This is, of course, an incredibly common liberal view, and it's not one I really wish to discuss or contest here. That's not the point. But just suppose I disagreed.
Given his lack of a systemic critique, I suspect he may actually disagree, but I can't know for sure, and it's also not really the point. This is something one of his faves, good old Sam Harris, likes to engage in. Sam will often engage in hypotheticals, in thought experiments that are completely removed from all social, historical, political, and economic context, so that he can put forth a potentially odious idea without being criticized for it. The best part of this technique is that when he eventually is criticized, when someone recontextualizes his statements, suddenly they're taking him out of context, when in reality it was him who was ignoring context all along. So let's watch how Alex does it. I'm gonna let this next bit play out, and then I'll respond to it.
Suppose I try to tackle each one of these claims. I say, but you know that the vast majority of men don't believe in sexist tripes anymore, and racism's a thing of the past. Most people are incredibly tolerant, and there are plenty of straight allies within the gay community. What's the problem? Now imagine how a liberal might respond to that. It's not about overt majority opinion, they say. It's about systemic bias. It's about history and the structural disadvantages that exist for women and minorities based on a historically bigoted culture. Now, imagine I were to respond, but what about all the men who marched on Washington? What about the straight people at pride parades? Now, the response would come, that's great, that's wonderful, in fact. What we need more than anything is men tackling the problem of sexism that doesn't just hurt women, by the way, but also men themselves. But it's a cultural thing, it's a traditional thing, it's ingrained in society. This is a totally believable and plausible liberal conversation. Now let me show you the problem.
Oh boy, here we go!
I'm going to run the exact same conversation again, but this time, instead of talking about bigotry in society, I'll be talking about bigotry in Islam. So, suppose I say to a liberal that Islam is inherently sexist, with built-in racism and widespread homophobia. And suppose they disagree, tackling this claim by saying, well, you know the vast majority of Muslims don't believe in sexist tripes anymore. Most are incredibly tolerant. There are plenty of Muslim allies in the gay community. What's the problem? Now, imagine I respond, but it's not about overt majority opinion, I say. It's about systemic bias. It's about history and the structural disadvantages that exist for women in Islam and under Sharia law, in a historically bigoted ideology. Now, imagine they respond, but what about the Muslims who marched on Washington? What about Muslims at gay pride parades? My response would come, well, that's great. That's wonderful, in fact. What we need more than anything is Muslims tackling the problem of Islamism that doesn't just hurt non-Muslims, by the way, but also Muslims themselves. But it's a cultural thing, a traditional thing. It's ingrained in Islam. Now, somebody please tell me the difference between these conversations.
Ask, and ye shall receive, Alex. Now, to some of you, that may have sounded reasonable, even if you kind of feel like there's something up with it. And that's perfectly fair. Alex is very good with language, and he's careful about what he says. But there is a huge, gaping flaw in this comparison. In the first example, he's speaking in broad terms about patriarchal, racist, and homophobic structures within our society. And this, of course, includes the cultural, economic, historical, social, and yes, religious. Now, all these things can't really be separated from one another. They all influence each other. So when us lefties talk about systemic racism or patriarchy, we're talking about all these things at once because it's the only way to talk about them that actually makes sense. In the second example, he's broken down broader Islamic society, and bear in mind he hasn't specified which one, to just the religious. So this conversation only appears the same. He's being so painfully reductive that what he's saying can't possibly reflect reality, and it's why the hypothetical liberal would be right in both scenarios. Not only has the broader Muslim world experienced much more tolerant periods in the past, but Muslims who live in quote-unquote Western countries engage in what is admittedly disgusting behavior at far lower rates. And I'm sorry, but you can't explain a variable with a constant. And that's not to mention the history.
Yes, it's about history.
You know, the time that his country just drew lines through the old Ottoman Empire that only benefited them, or the time that my country backed coups and religious extremists, or the time that both our countries decided that it would be a great idea to just destabilize broad swaths of the area. And culturally speaking, both our governments prop up one of only 6 countries that doesn't at least pretend to be a democracy, and a country that is the primary exporter of that radical Islam he's concerned about. More Muslims at Pride isn't ultimately going to solve anything, though they are extremely welcome, as long as they're not cops. Islamism isn't Islam's problem, ironically enough. It's ours. We created a Middle East where inclusivity is terribly difficult because no left wing can exist. The US armed the group that became the Taliban specifically to fight the left wing in Afghanistan. The Shah in Iran executed anyone who vaguely challenged his authority, leftists included. And I don't think I need to tell you what Saudi Arabia does if they catch even a whiff of a vaguely emancipatory movement. And hey, Alex, Muslims have a patriarchy too. I mean, think about it, and forgive me, I'm going to stick with the most extreme examples. Covering up and controlling women, sexually mutilating them, executing gay men for not conforming to masculine standards, mandating that men have beards. This is textbook patriarchy, my friend. This all has a lot more to do with politics than it does with religion. You even said yourself in one of your Q&A videos that, if followed to the letter, you thought that Christianity was worse than Islam, which means that there must be something else going on, something external to the religion itself. Oh, and I know some of you are about to invoke the Enlightenment and say that the Muslim world needs one. But before you do, remember that the Enlightenment, at least for its time, was a left-wing movement. So that only reinforces my point. Alright, what else does he say?
I found an article recently discussing how, in response to claims of sexism, some men were tweeting "not all men" in self-defense. Now, the article is called 6 Reasons Not All Men Misses the Point, because it's derailing important conversations. Now, I implore you, really, go to that article, read it, see if you agree or not, then read it again, but swap "not all men" for "not all Muslims," and make other appropriate alterations. Now, if your opinion changes on nothing more than that basis alone, you're not being consistent.
I would also suggest that you read the article. It's not half bad, and it makes a point that I want to make in a minute. And as I already pointed out, it's Alex who's not being consistent. Let's continue.
Just for the sake of interest, I'll do the first one with you. Here it is. Number 1. Nobody was making claims about all men in the first place. Of course, this is alluding to the fact that people aren't saying that all men are sexist, just that male sexism is a problem that needs addressing. Now do the swap. Number 1. Nobody was making any claims about all Muslims in the first place. People aren't saying that all Muslims are evil, just that Islamism is a problem that needs addressing. You can see how fun this is.
Yes. Fun.
I'll leave the rest to your own exploration, but the title of this article speaks an important truth, after we do the swap, that is. It reads, 6 reasons not all Muslims misses the point because it's derailing important conversations. And that's exactly what the liberal defense of Islam is doing.
So, did he think that the original title of the article wasn't speaking an important truth? Because it was, and if you read the article like we both suggested, hopefully you would see that. For example, reason number 5, which states that toxic masculinity does affect all men. Now, I'm kind of curious. Did he want the Muslim flipped version to read toxic Islaminity does affect all Muslims? What? Let's be fair, though. He probably meant it to read as something like, radical Islamism does affect all Muslims, which it does, but again, that's not the fault of the Muslim world as a whole. As I already explained, Islamism is something that wouldn't exist without US and UK support, both past and present. And here in the US and the EU, it affects Muslims because they are systemically marginalized, and due in part to, good old-fashioned racism, but also because of a war on terror that is, again, almost entirely our fault. But let's talk a little bit about the thing he's trying to sweep under the rug here. Patriarchy. See, there's a reason why #NotAllMen is derailing important conversations, and it's because it's taking an individualistic approach to toxic masculinity, which is very much a systemic problem. Think about it this way. And bear in mind, I'm not a man, but I was raised as one. Men. We've all had those friends. You know the ones I'm talking about. They say stuff about women or gay folks or transgender folks that we wouldn't agree with, but we wouldn't correct them because they're our friends. Maybe we'd even laugh a little just to not be rude and then move the conversation forward. Or maybe you were one of these people, even if you regret your behaviors in the past. Lord knows I do. Statistically speaking, it's guaranteed that we had one of these interactions with someone who went on to harass, assault, or even rape somebody. Now, I want to be clear that we're not individually to blame for any of this. We contributed to an environment surrounding it, but unless we personally harassed, assaulted, or raped someone, and let's face it, far too many of us have, and far too many of us are unaware that we've even done it, it's not really fair to blame any individual one of us. Like Marianne Williamson said in her interview on the Rubin Report, where she just schooled Dave Rubin. It's wonderful. Please watch it. There's a difference between taking blame and taking responsibility. So even if we can't rightly be blamed for these toxic behaviors, we are responsible for these actions, not individually, but collectively. We could have corrected our friends, but we've been conditioned not to by the sorts of boys will be boys attitude that were taught to us by other men, that were taught to those men by other men, and so on and so on and so on. Back into the past it goes. So no one person is really at fault for any of this, and I don't have any simple solutions. I mean, other than just, trying to educate and better yourself. Honestly, it's not really my place to tell you how to take responsibility. You'll have to take that up with the marginalized folks. But I do know that stepping back and throwing up your hands and saying, hey, it's not me, I'm not a part of all this, is missing the point. Because we sort of all are. Even non-binary folks like myself and women perpetuate these attitudes. I can't even begin to tell you the number of on-the-street interviews I saw in 2016 of women who said they didn't really have a problem with Hillary Clinton, they just didn't think a woman could be president. And these women didn't come to this conclusion in a vacuum. They were conditioned to believe this. We can't blame them for it, but we can hold them responsible for Donald Trump. And the same goes for the Muslim world as well. These things don't happen in a vacuum. There are economics and politics and culture that we are all very ignorant of. Are you familiar with this disgusting meme? I'm not saying that this is what Alex believes, but I am assuming that he laughed at it at one point, like I did, to my eternal former new atheist shame. But his reductive attitude towards the Muslim world reflects this. For some of his audience, there is no daylight between his work and this meme. I guarantee it. And that's largely due to ignorance around Islamic society and culture and history. Ignorance that Alex exploits, whether he's aware of it or not. The fact is that Alex wouldn't be able to get away with his reductive view of the Muslim world if he were talking about a majority white region. And if his audience weren't primarily American. We are ignorant as fuck. Alright, let's wrap this up.
Now, I haven't even addressed the fact that within Islam, the problem of bigotry is even worse. This is because, according to most liberals, whilst in society discrimination is now constitutionally forbidden, it still exists culturally and within its framework. Now, with Islam, on the other hand, it still exists culturally too and within its framework, but worse, where society has constitutionally prohibited discrimination, discrimination is explicitly constitutionally mandated within Islam.
And here we see how history is a weak spot for him. But I already went over this. This is largely due to interference in the region.
Did you know that according to the Quran, a woman's testimony in court is worth half that of a man's? Or that women should inherit half of what their brothers do? Now, this isn't even a cultural problem, it's a judicial one.
Okay, here he's listing all the shitty things the Quran says, which, to be fair, they are shitty, but I could do this with any holy book. Much as I'd like to not play the apologist, anyone who's spent any amount of time studying religion knows that no one follows their holy books 100%, even those who claim they do. I could also do this with any country's constitution, at least those who bother to write it down, because we know that he's talking about Sharia law. Frankly, I don't want to dig into the religious law of a culture that I'm admittedly ignorant of, unlike some people. But since the US and UK are propping up the world's largest theocracy, what was that Jesus said? Cast the beam out of thine own eye or some shit?
So liberals, please, if you don't recognize the contradictions between the doctrines of Islam and liberalism, then you're undeserving of the title. And to Muslim reformers, we need you. You're braver than I could ever hope to be. Please don't be silenced by regressives dressed in liberal clothing. There are still real liberals out there who do support you and your cause, and I like to think of myself as one of them. Proudly so, too.
Ah, yes. The regressive left. You getting some tingles? Little bit of spidey sense there? For those not in the know, the regressive left is a bit of crypto right-wing schoolyard bullshit to law-bit so-called progressives. I'm progressive. No, you're regressive. To the best of my knowledge, it was originally coined to refer to left liberals who simply don't want to demonize Muslims. But at this point, it has about as solid a definition as cultural Marxist, which means it just means whatever you want it to. Now, like I said, Alex is very careful about what he says, and I'm not saying he's using the most asinine version of this, especially since the original fits what he's talking about. But it is concerning since, like I said, it is a term commonly used by the right and also used by his pal Stephen Woodford. But it's not like Alex will just openly take Tucker Carlson's side or defend Stefan Molyneux or Jordan Peterson. But he does have a Twitter. And as all Twitter users will know, you might think before you tweet or retweet something, but likes? Man, who gives a shit? Like away! So, what are some of the things that Alex likes? Well, he liked this tweet from the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's website. He liked this tweet from Senator Rand Paul saying, "Happy birthday to Milton Friedman, one of the architects of neoliberalism," which was terrible. Oh, and Friedman also advised Augusto fucking Pinochet. Ugh, look him up. He liked this tweet by Barry Weiss claiming that Vanity Fair, fucking Vanity Fair, is a gateway to the alt-right rather than the intellectual dark web she props up. A claim that has actual evidence. He liked, well, who cares if it was this particular tweet, literally any tweet by Count Dankula. He liked this tweet by Ayaan Hirsi Ali calling notorious anti-feminist Christina Hoff Sommers credible. He liked this tweet by this disgusting fucking chud of Donald Trump just lying. He liked this tweet by Ted Cruz, a man so reviled that even Republicans don't like him, and a tweet that I could dedicate a whole video to its wrongness. He liked this, and seriously, they were right next to each other. Tweet by Ben Shapiro harassing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a U.S. congressperson with better things to do than debate internet twerps, and this tweet by Jordan Peterson, and hold on, I'm going to actually have to explain this. So this was in the wake of the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, where an inhuman piece of shit murdered 51 people at 2 different mosques on March 15th in 2019. In the wake of this, Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, was pulled from bookstore shelves. As far as I know, Peterson had no direct connection to the shooter and was not mentioned in the shooter's manifesto. However, Peterson does have a lot of bigots in his audience for some reason, like this one. This picture was taken in New Zealand a month before the shooting, and when it resurfaced, the company in question didn't want to be seen associating with Peterson. So, the tweet that Alex liked was Jordan Peterson mocking the idea that Islamophobia was a problem and comparing Islamophobes to fucking wizards when an Islamophobe literally just murdered 51 people. Alex thought that was funny. Oh, and he also liked this.
Hey Brad, come here.
What's up, Stace?
This Ben Shapiro guy looks awfully familiar.
Yeah, you're right.
I think we went to college with him.
Yeah, he kind of looks like that,
Ben Shapiro, bro!
Heating up. I'm on fire. Unlike you haven't made any cups. Going for an island.
Bro, you can't do an island when you're on fire.
Actually, it turns out that you can. Facts don't care about your feelings, bro. Game over. I just destroyed your argument. Go back home to mommy.
This guy has no idea.
I know, what a loser. Total loser.
Bro, enough is enough. It's not funny anymore.
Now let's make his night even worse. Grab an egg. Come on, don't be shy.
Come get you, kid. Bro was doing this. I'm gonna mess you up. The fuck?
Oh no, 5-0. Quick, beat it. Scram!
This is Alex's political compass. Now, I know that the political compass is a gross oversimplification of politics. It's a lot more complicated than a grid. But you know what I think? I think these weren't his first results. I think when he first took the test, he was pretty squarely on the right, so he went back and fudged it a little bit so that he could claim to be on the left. But Alex, you are not. Even if I'm full of shit and your political compass was accurate and it was the first time you did it, you're not on the left, my friend. It's pretty clear that your economic and social interests align with the right. I mean, that Milton Friedman tweet fucking sealed it. You can't like Milton Friedman and claim to be anywhere on the left. And to be clear, I don't think this makes you a bad person or anything. I just think that we need to be clear about where economic and social interests lie. And Alex, I don't see anything that indicates that your economic and class interests align with working class politics. And working class politics are the real politics of the left. And the left, I am happy to report, is growing. Right now, we're in the midst of a political realignment, and it looks like it's gonna be a big one. As I'm sure we're all aware, in the 70s there was a political realignment that ushered in Reagan and Thatcher, and politics shifted to the right. But in the wake of the crash of 2008, politics are shifting to the left. I mean, look at the Occupy movement. A bunch of people were literally trying to start a quasi-anarchistic, decentralized society at a park in New York, and that's how this shit started. And yes, the right has continued to move right. I too notice the fascists are back. But, and this is my gut feeling here, I feel like the alt-right, Brexit, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, these are all desperate last gasp, a last attempt to grab all the wealth and power these fuckers can before it starts getting taken away. Because neoliberalism is over. It died in 2008, and its corpse has continued shambling because, well, nothing has replaced it yet. Now, it could be all this right-wing nationalism that will take its place, but I think the left is going to win. Jeremy Corbyn is almost certainly going to be prime minister, and it's increasingly looking like the American Democratic race is going to be between the two furthest left candidates we've had in like a century. So Alex, I invite you, engage in some self-crit, become a class traitor, and join us on the left. You're smart. You're a lot smarter than I was at your age. You're probably smarter than I am right now, if I'm being honest. We could use you, and I know you love to read books, and that's great, because there's about a ton of leftist reading lists out there. I'll put some down in the description in case anyone's interested. Now, I know that my channel is tiny and Alex will probably never see this, but if he does, and since I know he likes to do debates, I want to just be upfront and clear about my complete unwillingness to debate him. Debate is terrible. It almost never demonstrates the truth and is almost entirely a performance. It's entertaining, sure, but it's not productive. But in lieu of that, and this was something I didn't realize I wanted until I went through his Twitter and I saw somebody reply to him and tell him that he should have a conversation with Oliver Thorne of PhilosophyTube. I want this to happen, and not because I think Ollie will own Alex or anything. That's very much not what Ollie does. I think the two of them can have a really productive conversation. They're both smart, they're into philosophy, they're very well read, and most importantly, they're both British. Seriously though, on the off chance that anyone who sees this can, help make this happen, let's make this happen. That would actually be really cool, actually. Alright, now I'm gonna go shop for women's sweaters because clothes have no gender, and it's fucking bullshit that women just get to have all the snuggly, warm, colorful, soft sweaters. Don't just get to have them all. We shall expropriate the warm sweaters in the name of the working class. Join me, comrades. Sweaters for all shall be our cry. We will build a glorious, snuggly, warm workers' utopia.